China and the world. You may be wondering why this time period begins at 600 CE. Here's why. Leading up to 600 CE, the Roman Empire had just fallen, as well as the Han Dynasty in China. Both of these events allowed for more interaction to occur between these regions as well as others. Decentralization was also a main component that happened starting at this time period due to the collapse of these classical empires. All of these components came together to form the time period from 600 CE to 1450 CE. The first Chinese dynasty that was established during this time period was the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty began in China during 618 CE under the rule of Emperor Huanzong. The Tang Dynasty expanded to include parts of Manchuria, Mongolia, and other parts of Southeast Asia as seen in the map below. Some distinct characteristics of the Tang Dynasty were how accomplished it was in terms of human achievement in many different fields and also the stableness it brought to China. All of this formed what is known as the Golden Age in China. The reason for this was the bureaucratic system they established using the civil service exams to select educated citizens to prominent positions in the system. This was based on Confucian principles. They also created an elaborate transportation network that led to an increase in trade and communication. In regards to women's rights, the Tang Dynasty was the home of the only woman empress, Wu Chao, to ever rule China. Besides her, many women never came close to holding as much power as her. Women were still viewed as inferior in the patriarchal system of China. Buddhism also had a large impact on China because many people felt drawn to it because of its emphasis on peace and quiet. Eventually, the extensive size of the Tang Dynasty took its toll and it collapsed in 907 CE. The Song Dynasty followed the Tang after a short period of unrest in 960 CE under Emperor Taizu. The Song Dynasty was very similar to the Tang Dynasty in many ways, and they are historically grouped together. They also went through a golden age at the peak of the Song Dynasty and were also very accomplished in many areas. The first magnetic compass was created during this time, which allowed for easier maritime travel. This bureaucratic system continued to be used as well as civil service exams. One difference between the Tang and Song dynasties was that the Song dynasty was not as expansive due to the pressure from the nomads up north. One new invention that existed was the printer, which allowed literature to spread throughout China and other regions. During this time, Neo-Confucianism also emerged, which incorporated Buddhist and Taoist ideals while still maintaining Confucian thinking. Women in the Song dynasty experienced nowhere close to the social freedom women in the Tang dynasty experienced. Foot binding became a popular custom among women and was a clear example of the suddenly intensified patriarchy. The Song dynasty fell to the Jurchens in the north and then eventually to the Mongols in 1279 CE, signaling the end of the Song dynasty in China. The Yuan dynasty was unlike that of the Tang and Song dynasties in that it was formed by the Mongols. The Mongols first invaded China from the north and worked their way south. The defeat of the Song dynasty was not violent, but in fact accommodated many of the Chinese people. This unification of China convinced some that the Mongols had the mandate of heaven and therefore had the right to rule. They moved their capital to what is now Beijing. While the Mongols made some accommodations to the Chinese, they largely dismissed Confucian scholars and did not allow the Chinese to Mongolize. The Mongol rule lasted less than a century and collapsed in 1368 when rebel forces triumphed. The Ming Dynasty was the last dynasty of this time period and never really ended during this time. The Ming Dynasty restored Chinese rule after the Mongol invasion and brought back traditional Chinese culture. It also brought back the tribute system that existed during the Tang and Song dynasties. China had many cultural and political impacts on different regions nearby. The first area we will focus on is Japan. Throughout the Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties, Japanese voluntarily borrowed from Chinese culture opposed to it being forced upon them. Buddhist missionaries brought Chinese culture along with them in the 6th century. Prince Shotoku established reforms which brought back Chinese culture in a series of large-scale missions. Although Buddhism became popular in Japan, it never replaced Shinto beliefs. Japan also borrowed many cultural and legal ideas from China, such as the bureaucratic and legal reforms, but rejected the civil service exams and Confucianism. In fact, two capital cities of Japan were modeled after the capital of China. What made Japan different from Vietnam and Korea was their ability to borrow from China without losing their identity. Korea and Vietnam both had somewhat similar experiences with Chinese cultural influence. The Tang Dynasty deployed large military campaigns in both regions to expand trade. Both regions borrowed from Chinese culture but also kept its popular culture intact. They both participated in the tributary system while keeping their political independence. At the same time, there were some differences between the two. In Korea, they did not value their independence as much as the Viets did in Southeast Asia. The Koreans accepted both Confucianism and Buddhism. The Vietnamese maintained their own traditions and culture and constantly revolted against the Tang Dynasty.